Our next point from the original relation is 2, 1. Our new point would be 1, 2. Our last point was 4, 2, so in the inverse it will be 2, 4. So remember, the inverse, you switch the x and the y from the original. If you're looking at a table of values, the x's from the original become the y's in the inverse. The y's from the original become the x's in the inverse. To find an inverse relation, there are 2 steps that I'm going to drastically oversimplify. The 2 steps are, number 1, switch x and y. Step number 2, solve for y. That means get y by itself.
Is this when we just picked 2 points?
No, we're actually going to switch them and solve them. So in example 2, find the inverse. Our first step is to switch. So the y becomes x and the x becomes y. Our next step is to solve. That means get y by itself. What should we do first to get y by itself?
Add 4.
Add 4 to both sides. Now we've got 2y. We want plain y. So we need to divide both sides by 2. And I'm going to rewrite this with the y on the left. Y equals x plus 4 all over 2. That would be our inverse. Now look at the original and look at the inverse. After you do this a few times, you can start to notice when things are inverses. Notice in the original we have 2 times x, and in the inverse we have, bless you, divided by 2. In the original we have minus 4, in the inverse we have plus 4. So think about when you're solving equations, how do you undo things? That's what the inverse is going to look like. Number 3, first step is switch. Y becomes x and x becomes y. Now we need to get y by itself. We would add 7 on both sides. Dividing by 2/3 is messy. Instead, we multiply by the reciprocal. And on the left side, we'd have to multiply that whole thing by the reciprocal. That would cancel that. So we have y equals 3/2 times x plus 7.
That's our answer.
That's our answer. That's our inverse.
Is it going to get any harder than this?
Not really, no.
Yes.
Functions are inverses of each other provided that f of g of x equals x. Basically, the inverse is going to undo everything from the original function, leaving you with just x. If there's a minus 7, the inverse is going to have a plus 7 to make that minus 7 go away. If there's a times 2, the inverse is going to have a divided by 2 to make it go away. So if you plug one function into the other and you end up with plain x, that means they are inverses. So basically, if you see the word verify, if you see the word verify, that means do f of g of x and see if you get x. So number 4, we're just going to do number 4. We're going to skip number 5. Verify that f and g are inverses. So we are going to do f of g of x. My f function is 1/3 times something minus 1. We are going to put the g function in place of that x. So the 3x plus 3 is going to go in those parentheses. if we distribute, what's 1/3 times 3? Anyone? 1/3 of 3? 1. 1/3 times 3 is 1. So if we distribute, we will end up with 1x plus 1, and then we have the minus 1 from after the parentheses. Positive 1 and negative 1 is 0, so we end up with just x. If you end up with just x, then those are definitely inverses of each other. And really, as you get familiar with this, if you look at them, you can tell. The g has a times 3, f has a times 1/3. Times 3 and times 1/3 are inverses, they'll undo each other. The plus 3 and the minus 1, that's a little bit harder to see, but that's because it's 1/3 times and 3 times. I want you to write this in your notes. F negative 1 of x is called F inverse of x, and it means the inverse of the f function. So it's just notation. You know how f of x is like a fancy way of saying y equals? Yep. F negative 1 of x, f inverse of x is a fancy way of saying the inverse of the f function. On the next page, we are going to find the inverse of power functions. And this is definitely on your test. We definitely need to go over this. Okay, f of x is a fancy way of saying y equals. We'll get to this x is greater than or equal to 0 in a minute. Right now, let's just focus on the function. And remember, f of x is a fancy way of saying y equals. So if we want to find the inverse, step 1 is switch x and y. Y becomes x, x becomes y. Step 2 is solve. Get y by itself.
Square the y.
Square root the y.
I meant to say that, but
You're not done. You just made a silly mistake.
And when we put a square root in there, what do we have to put in front of the square root?
I just wanted to.
Sorry, ignore the corner of the room that's talking a whole bunch right now. Wow.
quiet.
When we put a square root in, we have to put a plus minus in front of it. So plus minus x, plus minus the square root of x equals y. If we change this back into function notation, this is now the inverse. So f inverse of x equals positive or negative square root of x. Does it make sense that x squared and square root of x are inverse functions? They undo each other? Yeah. Now let's talk about this x is greater than or equal to 0. This is basically saying positive numbers only. If they want us to find the inverse using the positive numbers only, they are basically telling us which part of that symbol to use. They're telling us the positive numbers only. So that little statement is saying that the inverse is going to be the positive square root of x. You can write that positive in there, but you don't have to. So in number 6, they said positive numbers only, and we only used the plus sign in the plus minus. Take a look at number 7. It's asking us for negatives only. So in that plus minus symbol, which symbol do you think we're going to use in front of the radical?
Minus.
The minus. So let's do this one. F of x is a fancy way of saying y equals. To find the inverse, we switch x and y. So y becomes x, x becomes y. We need to get y by itself, so we divide both sides by 3. How do we undo y to the fourth? The fourth root, the radical with an index of 4. And normally, when we put in an even index radical, we have to put a plus minus in front of it. But they told us negatives only, so we only want that negative. So instead of the plus minus, we just want a negative in front. Okay, we've got y equals the negative fourth root of x over 3. To rewrite this nicer, we put the fourth root of x over 3 with the negative in front of it on the right side. On the left side, we need the fancy label that means the inverse of f, which is f negative 1 of x, f inverse of x. And that's where we're going to stop today.